episode of AI Chronicles. And today's episode is definitely interesting, mainly because it's a great topic of responsible AI and LLM evaluation. I know that, LLM evaluation is another one of the topic in town for discussion. And there's a lot of research going on. There's a lot of tools coming up for evaluation. And that's why I invited my guest for today, Advitya from Microsoft. He's a machine learning engineer there, and I'll let Advitya briefly introduce himself. Hi there.
Hi Sonam, thanks for having me. Just to give a quick intro, my name is Advitya. I currently work as a ML engineer at Microsoft. I've been working for about 3 years now, and I have gotten to work on a variety of ML projects. For the first 2 years, I was in a rotation program, so I got to work with a variety of teams. And since last year, I have worked in the area of responsible AI and AI safety. And initially, I got to work with image models or vision models. And this year, it's quite a bit about large language models.
I bet.
And yeah, before that, I had graduated from UC San Diego and I majored in data science.
Awesome. All right. So, thanks for that introduction. That was very helpful. And let's get started. And usually I start my first question with the basics related to the topic. So I would love to know your perspective about what is responsible AI and why should people know about it?
So responsible AI is like a really broad umbrella term, right? And there's similar terms floating around like this, like AI safety, for example. My understanding of this umbrella term is it's kind of about a set of like practices and approaches towards building AI in a way that is safe, reliable, doesn't encode human biases,
Hmm.
and ideally does not harm the end users using that AI in any way, right? So that's like a broad umbrella definition of responsible AI. And there are, of course, a variety of pillars and considerations on like safe practices in terms of actually building, deploying, and operationalizing AI to customers. And the reason that this is so critical now is that just to give you like a broad philosophical perspective that I have, compared to the traditional machine learning landscape before large language models like ChatGPT came in, a lot of those models were not exactly generative models. Their outputs
Hmm.
were usually constrained to like certain labels, for
Right.
example.
Mm-hmm.
Supervised learning was like one of the most
Right.
common applications for ML out there. But now, with the advent of generative AI, we have now entered a paradigm of AI where the outputs are a lot more free-form,
Mm-hmm.
descriptive, and that has a great benefit of really enhanced versatility of usage among different
Mm-hmm.
kinds of consumers for a whole variety of applications. But that also exponentially increases really the importance of responsible AI
Yeah.
because of the number of entry points or the kinds of different ways in which these applications will really need to be tested to actually be reliable end to end, and the potential number of breakpoints that might exist in these applications that could even be utilized by bad actors, kind of trying to hijack these applications in any way. So it's a really interesting double-edged sword in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, do you think like people realize how important it is to, especially when they're building any of these generative AI applications or traditional ML apps, do they realize that how important it is for them to understand what is responsible AI and how they should bring in or consider all these safety aspects or biases and all those things?
I'm really glad you brought this up, Sonam. So, from my experience working on responsible AI tooling, initially for image models and then for large language models, and also talking to people that have been working in this area for a longer
Right.
time as well, I initially got to observe that responsible AI practices initially were less of first-class citizens in the machine learning lifecycle and more of an auxiliary thought in
Yeah.
terms of like, okay, maybe we can also improve this model and kind of do stuff better. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the tooling around following RAI, around like baking in RAI practices into models was quite fragmented. So it just involved a lot of extra effort to
Mm-hmm.
really kind of address those kinds of considerations. And also, people probably did not worry as much about it relatively in the industry, just because there were perhaps less failure points or compared to right now, because certain aspects of models, like the kinds of outputs or the amount of or the kind of training data that you supply to them and the structured requirements of that data were
Mm-hmm.
relatively more constrained and more uniform and more disciplined than they might be right now with the kind of
Right.
unstructured data we've been dealing with.
Yeah.
Now, I'm pretty glad to tell you, Sonam, that with large language models, a lot of companies perhaps using these models or building their own custom applications have really started to get more awareness on how critical it is now to really integrate these practices, these safe practices into their applications because of a variety of real world examples that we have already seen where
Right.
a bunch of say like large companies releasing certain kinds of large models out in the open, which probably outputted something bad or which actually had some vulnerabilities exposed in them. And we have seen these quite a few real world examples that can also not only affect the end users using those models, but can also really affect the reputation and image of a company. And so
Mm-hmm.
companies are really starting to be cognizant of this as they start really operationalizing these models.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a good time to be doing that for sure. So we you spoke a little bit about LLMs, and I'm sure we'll discuss a lot about LLMs throughout the rest of our discussion. I'm curious, so what do you consider to be the most critical aspect or aspects of responsible AI when developing and deploying large language models? I know you touched a little bit on that, but yeah, just curious if you have anything else to share.
Yeah, so there's quite a few critical aspects, of course, for these models from an RAI
Mm-hmm.
perspective. And perhaps we can try to bucket these into like a couple categories that just pop into my head right now. One could be bias. So making
Mm-hmm.
sure that these models don't encode human biases, right?
Right.
So a key way of perhaps mitigating that could be data curation, making
Yeah.
sure that whatever data goes into these models
Mm-hmm.
ideally does not encode that bias.
Yeah.
Having the metrics to track how the model is performing along these parameters. Another critical area is transparency, and this is probably one of the most popular ways that I have seen these RAI guardrails being baked into custom LLM applications out there personally with, for example, design patterns like retrieval augmented generation or RAG to really make sure that the outputs of a model are really grounded in some data that is factually accurate, right? And to even cite the sources in several cases on where the LLM got specific facts in its response from.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
transparency is another important pillar, which seems quite popular to me as
Yeah.
well. Another interesting pillar is privacy, and really
Ah.
making sure that the model does not output anything that it's not supposed to reveal. That can be
Mm-hmm.
anything from any sensitive info that initially got into the model during the training process, or even confidential instructions like system prompts on how the model is actually supposed to behave and how it's supposed to
Mm-hmm.
approach a user query. Perhaps even making sure that certain responses may be anonymized in terms of making sure that no sensitive information is revealed. And I guess one last pillar that pops into my head right now is kind of also related to robustness of an application, related to testing and
Mm-hmm.
stress testing against adversarial attacks. and I believe one of the most common sort of attacks can be prompt injection attacks, making sure that if we kind of try to simulate an environment of like trying to red team these models or trying to
Right.
purposely give it adversarial inputs and trying to
Mm-hmm.
see how the model performs so that we can identify these issues well ahead of time before it actually comes to deploying these applications.
Very well said. And all those points are really important. I totally agree with you. And it's true. Like recently, I've started hearing a lot about prompt injections, and I'm like, what is that? I need to figure this out because I've heard about SQL injection and all those things, but prompt ones, these were new. And I'm like, oh man, people have to be careful for that, especially because prompt engineering is like just such critical aspect of just LLM ecosystem. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So, now speaking about risk, what are the potential risk of not prioritizing RAI in the development and deployment of LLMs? And personally, like, have you encountered any scenarios where these risks were realized?
Oh yeah. I guess I don't even need to speculate on this answer, Sonam, because we've
Yeah,
already seen real world examples of stuff going down.
right.
It's anywhere from, say, like one large tech company perhaps releasing a model and then kind of rolling back that model, say, fairly quickly if that model is outputting something bad. We have even seen examples like a lawyer in New York, for example, that cited court cases that they generated from ChatGPT, only to
Yeah.
realize those cases were completely made up. We have also seen really kind of striking revelations where even large tech companies that may have been trying to really take these guardrails like very seriously and really trying like their best initially to develop these models still see certain kinds of user inputs that they hadn't that they hadn't probably encountered before. And
Mm-hmm.
there were also instances of certain models overcorrecting their responses, because of which, like, they would stand well on certain factors like bias, technically, in terms of like certain metrics like the demographic sort of parity
Mm-hmm.
kinds of metrics or equalized odds, things like that. But at the same time, also not do as well on transparency or on revealing the source of those answers.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I don't want to get into very specific examples because I don't want to badmouth
Yeah.
these companies, but there have been these really interesting examples of issues with end users, issues with the model just saying something bad, or even issues with the model trying to really do well, but then ended up overcorrecting
Mm-hmm.
their own responses and generating just factually inaccurate stuff. This has happened like with like large popular companies. And so not
Mm-hmm.
prioritizing this has already kind of had ramifications that are very serious and need to be considered if you really want to rely and trust these applications for any part of our daily
Mm-hmm.
workflow.
Right, right. Rightly said. Okay. Yeah, that was really good information. I'm still processing all what you said. So I want to take a pivot and talk about the LLM evaluation because I know if we continue talking about RAI, I don't think there's a stopping point at all because
Mhm.
there's so much to discuss and to understand to be even. So talking about evaluation, what are your thoughts over the LLM benchmarks? And
Mhm.
particularly, like, are they entirely trustworthy, or would you recommend AI practitioners to take it with grain of salt?
Okay. um, yeah, I love the specificity with which you pose this question. Um, so it's great that we have so many LLM benchmarks that
Yeah,
exist out there. Lots of open source data sets. So it looks like the open source community seems to have like done really well
yeah,
in terms of bringing in more discipline to the LLM evaluation process. Um, tr- uh, Using benchmarks to evaluate results is, of course, one of the more fundamental ways of
right.
initially evaluating large language models, even as
Mm-hmm.
soon as they're trained, before even deciding to use use that as a base model for making any custom LLM applications. So
Mm-hmm.
using benchmarks, like open source benchmarks, seems to be like a very initial step in the process, and of course, still an important one. In terms of how good or bad they are, obviously it depends a lot on the benchmarks. And the way that I would characterize this landscape would be like a Pareto curve, Sonam,
Mm-hmm.
where we have so many model SKUs out there, different number of parameters, different levels of performance. It feels like an arms race with like every model
Yeah.
vendor trying to one up each other on like different
Yes.
kinds of leaderboards. And
Yeah.
so the way that I try to make sense of this is to identify certain kinds of like specific applications that we ultimately want to build a custom LLM app for,
Mm-hmm.
identifying open source benchmark datasets or popular benchmarks related to that, and then kind of looking at the Pareto curve in terms of how other models are performing and kind of comparing like their
Mm.
performance levels with how mission critical is it for us to get super accurate responses versus cost? What is the trade-off there? And what is the distribution of values that we are even
Right.
seeing?
Mm-hmm.
And I now cite distribution of values because it's not just about measuring like 95% versus 98% or something like that. There are also benchmarks where I believe even the state of the art performance for LLMs may not be that high. One example that pops into my head is Devin, I believe, the AI software
Yeah.
engineer. I believe they had boasted state-of-the-art performance in several software engineer in
Mm.
several suite tasks, and I believe they had claimed state-of-the-art performance in one benchmark, and that state-of-the-art performance was 13%. I believe over 4% ish for like base GPT model, if my memory serves me right, and that
Interesting.
obviously seems like a great jump. But also, if you consider that benchmark and the number of detailed and complicated questions that they had, we're still
Mm.
quite far. We may still feel that we're still quite far away from perhaps like these models really beating human level accuracy in certain cases. So whether these benchmarks are good or bad, of course, depends on the benchmarks, how popular they are, and what we actually want to use them for. And then after that, it kind of feels like an interesting optimization problem where after
Yeah.
a point, you're just looking at the curve, like on the,
Yeah.
like
What could we
as like
do?
a
Should we fine
performance
tune?
comparison and
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
see like what makes the most like tangible sense for us.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah, I was in a reading group session a few weeks back, and we were talking about like this paper, and they had some LLM evaluation, like benchmarks for Gemini models and some other models, and it's like people there, like the audience was very what do you call suspicious if that's how, or if this is like the thing that we should follow. And like as you said, like considering what are the trade-offs and even like the domains and or the use cases that you're working with, I would think that yes, the benchmarks would differ from use case to use case, the data set like you mentioned, and just yeah, many things to consider before, or at least like the conclusion at least of that reading group was that it's a good start. Benchmarks are a good start to moving forward. Do we trust it as is? That's still a question. But because there's
Yes.
so many factors involved, like the
Yep.
ones you mentioned too.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
glad that you've like made this kind of like description so clear and simple to understand here because I have also seen demos say with Gemini and like one of the demos seemed to be really compelling. Like they probably inserted like a whole textbook of
mm,
like some automotive vehicle description or Harry Potter and they're able to like solve the needle in a haystack problem with getting like particular page numbers from
mm,
an input of some text that was already there in the document. That looks great. It looks like they have great context window, but I've also heard opposing perspectives that some
yeah,
people were saying that, hey, it did not work well in my personal case. So it's a very interesting sort of
yeah,
discussion to
for
be
sure.
had and yeah, there would be sufficient time spent for evaluating it.
I bet, I bet. And yeah, so what are the key metrics you track to monitor the performance and behavior of LLMs in production environments, especially like, I'd love to learn a machine learning engineer's perspective on this for sure.
Yeah. So evaluation kind of happens at a variety of stages, Sonam.
Right, right.
We just talked about benchmarks, for example, that
Mm-hmm.
might even happen before we even choose a base model to potentially even use and build our custom application on top of. Then evaluation can potentially happen when you've built your custom application, even after you've done all that experimentation on how you want to build it, different kinds of hyperparameters around things like RAG and like model parameters and things like that. Then there can be evaluations on like how's that model actually doing before you push it out to production. And then there can be like another suite of testing to really monitor its performance and also getting user feedback and things. So in terms of some of the top metrics that we might think of prioritizing, so from my personal knowledge and experiences and learnings, it seems like we can kind of categorize these metrics into a couple of buckets. One
Mm-hmm.
bucket could be quality or performance, just like how accurate or how well performant is the model in terms of answering the question correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Another bucket could be um, safety oriented metrics or like RAI, more so like safety oriented and making sure that the inputs or outputs don't have like responses that are bad or that kind of like or that force the model to say anything bad. Those are another suite of metrics. A third bucket could be mathematical metrics. A lot of these quality or safety metrics or quality or performance or safety metrics can be quite expensive to compute as well, because typically there's a judge LLM under the hood
Oh yeah.
that might
So
be actually, yeah, working on that definition and actually making that determination. So there are also a bunch of vanilla text metrics, which can be calculated like mathematically. There's perplexity and like different
hmm,
kinds of text metrics which can be relatively cheaper and more interpretable in some way,
interpretable.
at
Yeah,
least
yeah.
to people who have a background in NLP.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so we kind and then of course like new metrics can come up based on the modality of data. If the model is multimodal, for example, and
Mm,
dealing with like images or audio, things like that. So there's a variety of these buckets. And then if I like try to go deeper into that, then there's groundedness and there's relevance and there's all these kinds of like fine-grained metrics. But this
mm-hmm.
is like the broad set of buckets that I would characterize the
Right.
metrics into in
Mm-hmm.
terms of trying to make a more holistic assessment of the application.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, so I have two more questions for you. I know we have been
Mhm.
speaking a lot and there's a lot of information to grasp. So I'm just gonna leave you with two more questions. That's it.
Mhm.
So, what strategies do you use to monitor LLM biases post-deployment? And if you find any biases, how would you address them, the ones that are detected?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a complicated question, Sonam. And here's why. So after production, right? If we have after like we have done all the testing that we
Right.
can on our side, conducted all of
Mm-hmm.
our audits and all that stuff, as some AI practitioner developers say, hypothetically building some custom application, right? And
Right.
now if the practitioner has to monitor them in production, in an ideal world, if I was that person, I would have loved to have access to ideally the inputs or outputs so that I
Mm-hmm.
know that like if any of the inputs or outputs are bad, I could try to like correct it against that and
Mm-hmm.
kind of know. In the real world, that may not be possible, especially with enterprise grade applications which might be dealing with sensitive internal confidential company data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in those cases, those prompts or those responses may not really go back to even the platform owner, let alone the
Mm-hmm.
model vendor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, in the absence of perhaps the actual inputs and outputs, really one of the key ways, Sonam, that pops into my head right now is user feedback.
Mm.
These are applications that really need to be developed in a very iterative way because
Right.
even AI practitioners cannot guarantee that they have all these answers. Performance can really vary based on not just the use case, but also different cultures, different languages.
Mm-hmm.
when we're making ethical considerations or what is deemed societally good, that can have subtle differences in perspectives based on the culture we're operating in and what sort of use case it's being used towards and who are the end customers.
End
And
customers.
so I think really what a lot of companies seem to try to do is they seem to release these models and they really seem to piggyback on user feedback, not just in terms of like a thumbs up, thumbs down thing, but even like a feedback column where users can even write about what they
Right.
did not like about a particular response.
Mm-hmm.
And then coming on to how do we actually improve the application based on the feedback? Of course, based on the feedback, we can perform certain kinds of data curation techniques. We can do some data augmentation. We
Right.
can do certain kinds of resampling, reweighting of the distribution of data that we want to feed into the models, whether from a RAG perspective or a fine-tuning perspective. And so there are a lot of those techniques where we can continually make sure that the kind of data that our model is kind of tuned on never
Yeah.
drifts away from the ideal intended behavior.
Right. Yeah. User feedback is so essential and could be used in many creative ways to improve any product. Awesome. Okay. So last question for you, and this is more around like, based on your experience and mentorship or advice. So what advice would you give to other machine learning engineers who are striving to implement RAI practices in their work, particularly with LLMs?
I see. For AI practitioners to implement RAI guardrails and bake them into their applications, specifically for LLMs, I think my number one suggestion would be I would highly encourage them to not reinvent the wheel. There are unlike a couple years back, fortunately, there's a lot more um, importance, discipline, attention, and time that has been poured into bringing in more discipline to RAI tooling and frameworks. A lot of these things do exist now that might even be open source. There are a bunch of open source data sets, open source tools, GitHub repositories. A lot of startups also seem to be emerging in this area with their own suite of like specific tooling for specific
Mhm.
kinds of RAI considerations as well. And so I would really highly encourage them to not reinvent the wheel when it comes to
Mhm.
thinking about these considerations, because there are already like a bunch of people who might also be working on like subparts of this challenge and are actually like publishing their work, whether academically or even like as like a tool that can be used by other people. And I would
Mm.
really encourage them to piggyback on those kinds of tools. Learning
Gotcha.
about those kinds of tools, even in the first place, even if someone wants to really implement a completely in-house solution, just learning about these tools that exist online will already give them like a really solid technical view on the different kinds of ways that people creatively try to break these models and then suggest approaches for. It's really interesting, like the kind of imagination that people can have in terms
Hmm.
of how they can kind of like make these LLMs steer in particular directions and what
Right.
kinds of guardrails would we want to implement against that. So there's already a great amount of literature that and tooling that exists out there. And I believe establishing baseline performance with existing tools is probably the most reliable way to go or to at least start with.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. That was, yeah, not reinventing the wheel is so essential and time saving too. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and sharing that really great advice. I'm sure it will be very helpful to the listeners and whoever is interested into getting into RAI and doing more LLM evaluation and this area particularly. Thank you so much, Aditya. It was really nice speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Sonam. I really hope this was useful and beneficial for your audience
Absolutely.
as well. So yeah, I had a lot of fun chatting with you. Thank you.